On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, Arab League and EU opposition to U.S. recognition of the Golan Heights as Israeli territory. What gives? A former U.S. ambassador to China speaks his mind on the state of China-U.S. trade talks. And a former Japanese prime minister on why good neighborly relations between China and Japan matter.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live from Monday to Friday on CGTN. U.S. President Donald Trump signed a proclamation on March the 25th officially recognizing the Golan Heights as Israeli territory. It marks a major shift in American Middle East policy. The international community considers the Golan to be occupied territory and rejects Israel's annexation. Syria has demanded its return as a condition for any peace agreement. Arab leaders also said that they would push for a UN Security Council resolution against the U.S. decision.
Our position in relation to the Golan Heights is very clear. It comes clearly established by the resolutions of the Security Council, and the General Assembly, as my spokesperson was able to yesterday clearly describe.
And let me be very clear, the European Union will continue to not recognize Israeli sovereignty over the territories occupied in 1967.
The Golan Heights is a plateau bordered by Jordan, Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. In 1967, the western two-thirds was occupied by Israel's military. Later, in 1981, Israel declared sovereignty over the region, a claim immediately and unanimously rejected by the UN Security Council. Nonetheless, Israel proceeded to build settlements there in direct violation of international law. There are now nearly 20,000 Jewish settlers living in over 30 settlements across the territory. There are also roughly 20,000 ethnic Druze in the Israeli-occupied area. The majority consider themselves Syrians and refuse to apply for Israeli citizenship.
On the outcome of the Arab League summit and the U.S. changing policy of the Golan Heights, let's turn to our panelists. In Washington, D.C., we have Ambassador Gerald Fairstein, who is the Senior Vice President of the Middle East Institute. Also, we have with us in Jerusalem, Marcus Sheff, the CEO of the Institute of Monitoring Peace and Cultural Tolerance in the School of Education. And also with us in our Beijing studio, Li Guofu, Director of the Center for Middle East Studies in China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Mr. Ambassador, how much does it mean, a change and a shift in U.S. foreign policy regarding the recent decision made by the Trump administration about Golan Heights?
Well, at the end of the day, it probably doesn't really mean very much. As your analyst commented earlier, the U.S. decision, of the Trump administration's decision, has been widely rejected by the rest of the international community, including the European Union, Russia, and the other members of the Security Council. So the reality has been that Israel has occupied the Golan Heights since 1967. It was not really an issue until now. It has been the subject of Israeli-Syrian negotiations over the years, and the Israelis have always made clear, every prime minister, including Benjamin Netanyahu himself, that they would be willing to return the Golan Heights to Syrian control as part of a peace package. The administration's decision to recognize doesn't really change any of that.
If I could just follow up, Mr. Ambassador, since you indicated it, the de facto occupation, does it necessarily mean a legitimate occupation? I guess that's the key issue here.
Well, within the context of UN Security Council Resolution 242, the Land for Peace resolution, Israel's occupation of the Golan Heights was legitimate until such time as there is a peace agreement between Israel and Syria, at which point the Israelis would be expected to return the Golan Heights to Syrian control. And this has always been the negotiating strategy between the two countries. The current issue within Syria means that the Syrian government really is in a position to negotiate with Israel.
Right.
But I think that the expectation would still be, if there were ever a return to negotiations, Golan Heights would be on the table.
Right. The fact that the Syrian situation is more complicated than just the Golan Heights itself makes the whole process much more complicated and much more prolonged than one would assume with Mr. Lee.
I think, this is an issue, as the ambassador has just now said, that, is a matter of the fact on the ground. And whether it will be and seriously change the status quo, I personally believe it will much depends on what, the Israeli, especially the Netanyahu government's going to do for the next. And since Israel sees the Golan Heights as the ambassador said that the serious Israeli government has very careful with this piece of land, never allowed the Jewish settlements to be there. And if after U.S. President Donald Trump has made this kind of decision, if the Israeli governments to let large, the settlements to be settled in the Golan Heights, that's changed, the facts.
Right.
And I believe that, this is a very bad example for the international law, and also violated the international law and as well as the UN Charter.
I see. Mr. Chef, coming from Israel, obviously we know where you stand, but the fact that the latest news suggesting Israel is likely to move 250,000 settlers onto the Golan Heights, what does that mean?
That's a quite remarkable number, and that is completely beyond anything which would be considered realistic. You can't just move people. The Israeli government, isn't going to pick up 250,000 people and move them to the Golan Heights, to the very best of my knowledge. Ultimately, anybody who wanted to go and live in the Golan Heights, for the last 50 years plus, has been able to do that. Not a lot of people do, because although it is quite beautiful there and life is lovely there, it is of course far out of the way from where people want to live, which is in the major cities by the coast where the jobs are and where the urban conurbations are. So, that's a remarkable statistic, and frankly, I have not heard that mentioned before.
That is according to the latest news coming out just 2 to 3 hours ago. We can confirm that after it's shown further onto the news. But Mr. Chef, the fact that it is a beautiful place, it is a place that many people want to visit, doesn't mean necessarily it has to be Israelis.
Well, I think as the ambassador said, quite clearly, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, sir.
I think, right. I think as the ambassador said, quite clearly, in reality, nothing has changed. All Israeli leaders have said that they will negotiate, with Syria, and many Israeli leaders had. But, the situation at the moment is one that nobody is going on the Israeli side to negotiate with the Syrians. The instability there is appalling. There are, hundreds and thousands dead, a raging civil war, the most appalling situation, and not exactly the environment that anybody is going to negotiate anything. But I think actually there is something interesting in relation to that. This was an issue at the Arab League. But, Syria has, of course, been expelled from the Arab League. However, real discussions which, should be of importance to the nations of the Arab League are barely touched upon. The leader of Qatar essentially arrived and then he left. The crisis between Qatar and Saudi Arabia
well, I don't
still
think,
rages.
Mr. Chef, but the relevant topics regarding this conversation is being mentioned by you. Can we focus on the real issue here, unless you want to shy away from the real issue? And may I go back to you, Mr. Ambassador? Ambassador Firestein, if I may, what does that mean for the Trump administration? Yes. If it has already done what it did, which is to recognize so-called Golan Heights as part of Israel, or legitimate occupation of Israelis, what does that mean for the next election? Because people understand a lot of the things done and said by this president. It's all about a ballot eventually 2 years from now.
Well, I think that there are two elections that factored into this decision. One, of course, was the Israeli election that is going to happen a week from today. And clearly the Trump decision was motivated by a desire by Benjamin Netanyahu to strengthen his position with his own right wing and to demonstrate that he can, in fact, produce results that right-wing Israelis will embrace, and that includes the recognition of Israeli sovereignty in the Golan. Within the context of the U.S. political situation, Donald Trump is likely to see this as something that pleases his base, and that is primarily Christian evangelicals who are these days within the United States domestic political scene the strongest supporters of Israel, far more so than the American Jewish community. So this will be popular with Christian evangelicals here, as well as rightist Israelis in Israel. And Trump clearly hopes that in both elections, this year in Israel, next year in the United States, it will improve his and Benjamin Netanyahu's prospects.
Mr. Schiff, on the other hand, with the upcoming election, as Mr. Ambassador just mentioned, how much of a political boost will that mean for Mr. Netanyahu?
It's a really good question, and the Ambassador quite rightly pointed out the timing. I think, though, very unfortunately for Mr. Netanyahu, the timing worked out to be not very good at all. While the ceremony at the White House with Mr. Trump and Mr. Netanyahu on this issue took place, actually Hamas fired a rocket into central Israel, hitting a house, wounding 7 people there, and that took over the news cycle in Israel, as you would imagine. Israelis horrified at a rocket attack coming from Gaza into Israel. So that took the oxygen away from this issue in the news cycle. So probably did not have the effect that might one have thought, given the elections coming up.
On the other hand, Mr. Schiff, we also understand the debate within Israel also taking place over the years regarding its relation with Palestine and also its relationship with, for example, issues such as the Golan Heights. One of the arguments is within Israel about the fact that more anger and more fear will be created as a result of Israel's aggressive actions and words toward the Arab world, and after that some negative effects would have on Israel anyway, eventually, in the long term. So, Mr. Schiff, how do you look at that part of the debate and the recent action taken by Washington, its long-term negative effect, possibly, even on the safety issue regarding Israel?
Yeah, I understand that that is the, you know, these, if you like, cliches are you know, acceptable, but actually in reality that's not what's happening on the ground. Israel's relations with the moderate Sunni countries have become very, very close recently. That is, of course, Saudi Arabia, other Gulf countries, of course, Egypt. Israel has a strategic relationship with now, and to an extent Jordan as well. So actually Israel is getting closer to many of its neighbors. Also, interestingly, of course, you know, the reaction of Saudi Arabia to the Golan news was, of course, a little muted because of the relationship that Saudi Arabia has with this White House as an ally against Iran. So, you know, these are regional issues. It's not always about, you know, Israel and the Palestinians, although, of course, one would very much like to see, you know, an agreement there.
Right.
But, you know, there are large regional issues at play here which do actually make a difference to these conventional wisdom cliches.
Mr. Lee, what is said is true in a way that the situation in the region is much more than just the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians, but rather there are regional players who have a very different agenda and at least the ways of doing things. And then there's also the U.S. relations with the Middle East as well. So, Mr. Lee, how do you see the entangled relationship and its impact eventually on this specific issue about Golan Heights?
I think, the Trump's decision and as much, has been embarrassed those, the American airlines in the region. And some people say that, his decision may be, in favor of, the BBN and Netanyahu's, elections, and also to gain some of his own space at home. But sometimes, people say that at the same time, at the cost of his own Middle East peace plan, which will be issued after Israeli elections. Because, since Trump has, not been regarded as very neutral and is one-sided, so it will be very, very hard for, the Arab countries, especially the Americans, airlines in the region to have any favorite support of the Americans' peace plan once American issued after Israeli election.
Right. What about the fact that the regional players also on the issue are very divided, given the fact that, for example, Saudi Arabia warming up its relations somewhat degree, at least to Israel, and how will those relationships change, eventually have an impact on how some of the most controversial and traditional topics about territories likely to be resolved?
I think, the Trump's decision, actually, I don't believe it will be, make, the Israel and those Sunni Arab countries more closer. Because those countries, I mean, the Arab countries, they are afraid, they are regarded Iran as a threat. But, as for the territories, they have to think about the people, the Arab people in general in the streets. And, this is a legitimate issue. So those Arab countries has to, whether they like it or not, has to make it very clearly. So this is reflected as the Arab League communicate. They have made it very clearly. They absolutely rejected, the Trump's decision to let Israel have this sovereignty over Golan Heights.
Right. Let's go to Ambassador Feinstein. 2 points mentioned by our earlier panelists. One is that this is likely, rather than divide the Arab countries, consolidate their core belief, at least apparently, which is to maintain their solidarity and unity toward the occupied territories, including with the Golan Heights. Secondly, is that the U.S. is going to be forever missing its neutrality in terms of proposing a peace plan or actions regarding the Middle East. Mr. Ambassador.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And what I would say, Mr. Shep pointed correctly at the cooperation that exists between particularly the Gulf Arab states and Israel regarding their common concerns about Iran and some other regional issues. But the administration's peace proposal, the long-awaited deal of the century, really depends very heavily on the willingness of the Gulf Arab states, particularly Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, to lead the way and to put pressure on the Palestinians to come to the negotiating table and to work out an acceptable resolution with the government of Israel. These decisions that the Trump administration has made, the Golan Heights being the latest, but also the decisions about Jerusalem, also the cutoff of assistance to Palestinian aid, have made it more difficult for Riyadh and Abu Dhabi to cooperate with the United States. And this latest, which is the recognition of Israeli occupation of the Golan Heights, does touch on a very sensitive issue for the Arabs, and that is the permanent loss of Arab territory. It will be very difficult, and I think that what you've seen in terms of the Saudi reaction has been, while it is muted, it nevertheless has been a very clear message to Washington that these decisions make Saudi cooperation very, very hard.
Right. And also there's a bigger impact on the international community about their thoughts of the so-called soft power of the United States, whether the U.S. will be still as convincing as they used to be about the Middle East policy as well, Mr. Lee.
I think, this is a very good question. And usually, American, I was promoting the peace process, and because, American has very close, has, the means to pressurize is really to give sort of concessions which can move forward the peace process. And also American act as always say, very balanced and neutral mediators. But as Trump, since he became the U.S. president, he has took one-sided policies. He's no longer regarded as a proper mediator for the Middle East peace. Not only the peace process between the Palestinian issues,
right,
but also the conflicts between the Arab countries and also as well as Israel.
In that regard, Mr. Marcus Sheff, how much do you think Israel can still count on Washington to bring up some real plan that others will follow in terms of trying to promote peace in the Middle East? Very briefly from you.
Well, briefly, this is the question that everyone's been waiting for an answer for months now. We do not know the contents of this peace plan. Frankly, nobody is desperately optimistic that it will be a breakthrough plan, but we all live in hope.
What kind of hope that we are living in, and what kind of disappointment are we living in? What is the road ahead? Finally, before we go, everyone, one sentence, gentlemen. Let's start from Mr. Ambassador Feuerstein.
Well, I think that in one sentence, it makes these decisions make the prospects of Israeli-Palestinian peace much more difficult, much more distant. We're not going to see very much progress, I'm afraid, in the coming years.
I see. Mr. Sheff.
Well, I think there's going to be an election next week. Obviously, on the basis of that, we will see what kind of government Israel has. But I think any and every government clearly can't negotiate with Syria at the moment, can't negotiate with the Palestinians given the state of the PA leadership. So short term, not looking good. Long term, I repeat what I said, we live in hope.
What kind of hope? Once again, I repeat my sentence. We'll figure that out in the future. Mr. Lee, final word from you also.
I think, the final, what I want to say is, the Trump's policy made the Middle East more unstabilized. The peace will be a long way.
All right. Gerald Feuerstein, Ali also Mr. Marcus Sheff, and also Mr. Lee Guofu as well. Thank you so much. Earlier, we also tried to reach a Palestinian panelist for this discussion who has agreed upon but did not appear in this discussion. We want to thank all of you for talking to us. Thank you. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program.